So what DTAL does is it turns that power over to everybody, pure democracy.
But in the context of these incentives, Synth is live. Does that mean Synth is also going to have its own token?
So yeah, 250, you can have 256 miners all contributing different models.
I mean, the industry is evolving at such a fast pace. I think even OpenAI can't answer the question.
Welcome back to The Roll-Up, your home for technical talks and open conversations that shape the modular future. Nothing on today's show is to be construed as financial advice. You can see our full disclosures list at therollup.co/ventures. Sit back, relax, and enjoy today's episode after a quick word from some of our awesome partners.
Imagine if the world's GDP moved on chain. Guys, say GM to SafeNet. The newest protocol by Safe isn't a blockchain and it's not a new layer 2. It's a transaction processing network built to send money anywhere and swap anything on thousands of layer 2s from a single universal balance in sub 500 milliseconds. It's fast, it's smooth, and it's simple. And it's built with safe multi-sig level security in mind. SafeNet unlocks smart accounts across multiple chains, allowing users to supercharge security, scalability, and speed. So get started today at net.safe.global and remember to follow @safe on X. GM. We are the roll-up today. Mog. We're going to get absolutely mogged by Mog. I already know it. And James is here to representing Mode. This one's going to be super fun. James, you're a friend of the show. Welcome back. Mog, it's your first time. So very, very cool to have you on and very excited to hear a little bit about you and then ultimately get into our subject today, which is going to be about Bittensor and the transitioning that's happening there, talking about decentralized and distributed compute. And then we're going to be talking about Synth, the new subnet on Bittensor. Lots to cover. So let's dive right in. Mog, welcome. First time.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. James, thank you for coming back. How you been?
Yeah, things are good. We keep building. That's what we have to do.
Oh yeah, that's what it's all about. And so today, distributed compute. I think the whole world of compute got thrown for a whirl a little bit, maybe about a week ago with DeepSeek. We kind of saw NVIDIA react to, maybe we don't need billions of dollars of compute to train these models. And so NVIDIA kind of reacted. Ultimately, we're still going to need plenty of compute. It's just there's a parallel there to like data availability. These things tend to just fill up, and then we need more and more and more as use cases get more expressive. And so when we're thinking about distributed compute, Mog, we haven't had a whole lot of deep coverage on Bittensor and the way that it works, how it works, what people use it for. So maybe you could kind of give us a prelude to Bittensor before we talk about some of the new and exciting things that are happening there.
Yeah, Bittensor's been around for just over a couple of years now, and originally as a network designed to distribute AI training, and then pivoting or moving over to inference as the kind of industry need and narrative focus more towards inference, and then going through an evolution into, or revolution, but an evolution into subnets, which essentially allowed what many people equate to L2s to be built on Bittensor, allowing individual entities, companies, organizations, individuals to build their own incentive mechanisms and value commodity marketplaces. The thing that Bittensor really does, which is what really piqued my interest, is it really sums up a true incentivized usage of blockchain distributed ledger and distributed compute. So obviously this is often equated primarily to AI, but you can use distributed compute for anything. The most efficient thing to do in terms of cost savings is to use GPU, and the most in-demand use for GPU, of course, at the moment is focused mainly towards AI.
Awesome. And before we get into subnets and how these things are becoming prolific and ubiquitous in the ecosystem, like when we're thinking about compute in general, what is the value add of doing distributed compute for inference or anything else versus using a Microsoft Azure or AWS etc., for more of a centralized compute? What's the value in doing it in a distributed way?
It's not just compute, it's expertise. It's both. It's distributing your workflow and incentivizing it. So whereas you can, of course, and there are many times when we've been building on Bittensor in the last few years where we would question, would this be easier not to do on Bittensor? And if the answer is yes, then potentially you're not using the network to its optimum design, because you can employ in-house expertise and fund in-house compute. But what you're doing by distributing the compute is you're also distributing the operators and those that are producing those commodity values. And that's really where the power comes from.
Awesome. Okay, James, feel free to jump in here because Mode has a lot of exciting AI agentic and DeFi primitives that are being launched on Mode. This DEFAI space is starting to take hold. So how are you guys starting to leverage this new sector that's popping up? And then ultimately, how are you guys using Bittensor to progress this initiative?
We've built our Mode and the L2's ecosystem to focus around like decentralized finance and AI use cases within decentralized finance. And as we were building this out, we kind of built out this stack. We built out the application layer, we built out the execution layer, the L2, and we were missing this data layer. And the type of data we needed was training data, price data, and loads of it for agents to essentially train on to get better at forecasting and trying to model volatility. And as Mark said, like, it's not just the compute which is important. This isn't like a massively intensive compute task, but it's more like the decentralized expertise, which are very important and improving. Yeah, already the subnet's been live just over, I think, around 10 days, and it's already proven extremely useful to have this access to expertise. Like, we could have just taken 5 data scientists, put them in a room, and said, model this out, right? But instead, we've decided to launch this subnet, design this incentive mechanism. So miners from all around the world, experts from all around the world are competing to produce the top models as the output of the subnet. And yes, so far we've seen that to be like extremely powerful. And yeah, it's been really interesting. We registered the subnet, roughly 10 days ago. And the kind of process for that was fairly straightforward. You speak to lots of different validators. They give you weights. Your subnet gets emissions. Miners come and essentially, work for those emissions. And validators validate and also receive emissions. And this is all about to change. Well, not all about to change, but some of this is about to change. I think it's actually a really exciting upgrade to the network, and something that I think a lot of people who are listening are probably also very interested in learning a bit more about. I'm sure Mog can tell everyone more about detail and what that means.
Yep. As you very rightly said, spinning up a subnet is was not so difficult, but there was a slight barrier to entry in that you need some Tau to do it. It's a dynamic marketplace, so the cost of registering a subnet was defined by the price, by the demand, and there is a limited number of subnets at the moment, currently 64. And so the cost or barrier to entry somewhere around anywhere between 1 and 3,000 Tau, with Tau at around $350, $400 at the moment, is a fair old barrier to entry, which means obviously you need to get some funding or be well funded yourselves. It also means that you are dependent on emissions. Emissions are the percentage of the network output that flows to you. 7,000 mirror tokenomics to Bitcoin, 7,200 pre-first halvening Tau are emitted into the network, and a percentage flows to each subnet based on, in the current mechanism, the voting, a stake-weighted vote by the top validators. Now, for shepherding the network and getting the network in the right direction, this has been a really, really powerful catalyst for the last year or so. However, as the financial barrier to entry increases and validators start to become funders, essentially take on a VC kind of role within the ecosystem, there is inherent bias that comes through. That coupled with the need to really understand value, you have to meet teams, analyze code bases, stay on top of vulnerabilities, because we can discuss the beauties of building an incentive mechanism and all of the idiosyncrasies that go with it later. But it's a lot of work to understand that value, and it was understood that that system was flawed if we were to expand beyond 64 subnets. And there's no reason why the ecosystem cannot expand beyond 64 subnets. The data exchange on Bittensor goes on off-chain. Each individual subnet and its operators operate between themselves off-chain and produce value off-chain. The chain is used for the incentive mechanism records. Recording the value of the participation, shall we say? So we're not limited by TPS and metrics that you would normally measure a blockchain. So we can expand to many subnets. But in order to do that, we needed to have a natural dynamic value marketplace. So what DTAO does is it turns that power over to everybody, pure democracy. If you hold Tau, you are able to govern the flow of emissions. And that is done through, this might get complicated for an evening podcast, through something called dynamic Tau. Currently, everyone stakes to a validator, and you essentially give that validator the weight to act on your behalf. The more weight a validator has, the more power their vote has as to the subnets that they deem to be of value. Whereas you can still do that is still an option. You can now take that Tau and say, I'm not going to allow the validator to vote. I am going to vote. I am going to say that this subnet and this subnet and this subnet have value. However, it is not a free ride. It's a risk-reward scenario. You can equate it to purchasing tokens or acquiring shares in that subnet. If you are right and that subnet increases in value, then the value of your shares, your tokens, they're called alpha tokens, in that subnet increase against the base currency Tau. In a very crude way, it's like investing in L2s back and forward between ETH. You can hold ETH and ETH will go up, but you're going to make more from investing in the right L2s. I'm not sure I like that analogy too much, but it is the one that is probably the easiest for people to understand. As a result, the price, market cap value of each subnet defines the flow of Tau. So if you think of the overall market cap of Tau being 100%, the percentage that your subnet holds is where the emissions flow. There are some slightly more intricate dynamics to it, but I think that's a good starting place.
I do want to get into Synth as a concrete example that we can explore as it relates to some of these incentive mechanisms. So you guys, are launching Synth as a subnet, and maybe in the course of this question we can also talk about what exactly Synth will do. But in the context of these incentives, Synth is live. Does that mean Synth is also going to have its own token? Or maybe better described, it'll have these A tokens that'll represent its subnet's relative market share in the context of all the subnets on Bittensor? Is that the right way to think about this?
Do you want it or shall I take it, James?
I can take it. So I think, yes. So yeah, essentially, yes. Every one of the 64 plus subnets will have its own alpha token, and Synth will have, so Synth is subnet 50. I actually don't know if it's going to be called Synth token or subnet 50 alpha token.
Called Synth token. It has either a Greek, Hebrew, or Aramaic letter. You don't know your token. I have to fire up Discord in the middle of this call in order to tell you. But it is there.
Yeah.
You will be a subnet 50. Are you ready? You want to know what you're going to be? That's a good point, because you are there and it doesn't say what the name of it is. I can tell you. I'll find out. You carry on.
Find out live.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. The best place as well for anyone listening for all this information is definitely Taostats, which Morgan team run. But essentially, yeah, what this does and why I think it's like so interesting, especially to everyone from the overall crypto community, is like BitTensor's previously been fairly a fairly small ecosystem, right? I'm sure there's hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of towel holders amongst exchanges and everything. But the previous dynamic has been like validators, miners, and subnet owners, right? And as Mog said, like you have to, as a subnet owner, you have to go to to the validators. You have to like tell them how great your subnet is, why it's improving the ecosystem, why it's really like net positive for the space, for all these things that we're trying to build, right? Whereas now, it's going to be like the open market. So as a subnet founder or a subnet owner, you have to now tell everyone, right? Every towel holder, not just validators, why your subnet has so much potential, as there will be this alpha token, or there will be all these alpha tokens which will launch. So yeah, it's a huge upgrade, and it's definitely going to increase speculation and give like a market value to subnets, which previously the value was just emissions.
Obviously, previously, as James said, you were very much marketing to the BitTensor community because they were the ones awarding your value, which was very good to keep things a sort of a quality control metric within what we were building, and that the community approved of it and it was the right direction. What we do now is to appeal to the larger towel holder, but again, that alone would be short-sighted because we're not appealing to current towel holders. What we want to do is attract investors into the subnets. But in order to do that, the true metric of value will be the value of your product, which essentially should hold value to users outside of Bittensor. Successful subnets will be running companies that produce valuable commodities and data that they monetize outside of Bittensor, where their end user may not ever need to know that the product they're using was generated or part of a product offering that comes from Bittensor. And it will be the revenue and business models of these subnet businesses and how they organize flow back to the accrual of value within their alpha token that will see those that succeed and don't. And this is where things really change. For a while, we pushed for revenue as a metric alongside pushing for value. Sometimes it's hard with scientific research-based subnets, but there will be an onus towards generating quantifiable value and being able to translate that value back into the alpha token. And if you are looking to maximize that, you should definitely be looking beyond the scope of just Bittensor users, which is, of course, where things are going.
Right, and that ultimately will build these inflow channels into the subnet ecosystem that are kind of like tentacles in all of these other industries outside that ultimately bring value. And then we'd like to think that there's network effects within the subnet ecosystem on Bittensor where people can kind of spread. We've had similar conversations to these, similar to like these roll up stacks. Not to belabor that analogy, but how does one net new user into an L2 on the OP stack benefit another chain on the OP stack? And I imagine that similarly, subnets that attract users from maybe the exterior AI or just general community ultimately impact and beneficially provide some net new user or net new unit of value to the rest of the subnets as they work together.
I mean, if you were to come in and realize that you were renting compute not from RunPod, but from a company that was built on outsourcing compute through a decentralized network and understood that, you might look around and think, hold on a minute, I could get my storage from there. I could get my inference from there. So yes, absolutely, there's a ripple effect to other participants and subnets.
And so specifically about Synth, like this is particularly in the DEFAI space. So I imagine that those who are looking to engage in crypto and potentially a user onboarding experience, very easy way, can leverage some of the tools that are going to be built on the Synth subnet for using, for instance, like an AI agent to go and buy tokens on our behalf, or pulling some data and setting some sort of algorithmic strategy that will programmatically buy the tokens that are newest launch or have the most volatility. James, maybe you could speak to the use cases that Synth subnet is specifically tailored for.
Absolutely. So synth is you're concerned with like the output of synth is forecast, like Monte Carlo simulations, simulated paths of price data for BTC right now, and it will expand to many different assets and actually many different industries. But it's all about essentially trying to forecast potential paths into the future for prices and creating synthetic data for this. And this is important to mainly to train agents on, because in the same way that Tesla, when they're training their autopilot, they don't just train it on the roads, they also train it in these simulated environments, right? So we can find all these different edge cases. It's essentially what synthetic data and having loads of it enables you to do. Synth's main focus right now is talking to teams who are building financial applications, agents that need to forecast into the future and understand like volatility of markets. So we've seen, I think, 12, 13 teams now use that, like adopt that API and start to build on that. And the interesting thing for us is like the subnet has grown fairly quickly. I think our weight is now like 1.6%, which is quite good. And the subnet's receiving emissions. So the data scientists, machine learning engineers, everyone who's submitting this data is earning emissions. But soon this is going to change with DEFAI, and we need to think of like what the kind of holistic overview of Synth looks like within growing Synth's alpha token, and also within growing like agents across crypto, and making sure that data stays very useful for that.
Okay, that makes a ton of sense. I want to circle back and just reinforce one of the questions that I had early on, which is, the purpose of distributed compute and why, in Synth's case, let's use, just to continue to use that as an example here, why is it particularly relevant for Synth to utilize a decentralized intelligence network versus using one of these centralized alternatives? Redstone is DeFi's modular oracle, supporting over 100 clients on over 50 chains and offering 1,000 assets. Redstone is the leader for Bitcoin staking and yield-bearing assets. They offer the most robust, customizable price feeds available in any model. Join the Redstone exhibition today.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I've done like a few data science competitions in the past, and some of them they give you like 5K, 10K, if you're lucky. And they usually start and they usually end, and that's it, right? And we try and so there's that as like a way like how things are currently run, right? Like how you currently get people together to compete on something. Then you have the other alternative, which is you hire 5 people, 10 people, 20 people, 50 people, 100 people. You put them in a room and you try and get them to all solve like this hard problem. Maybe they do it individually, maybe they do it by working with each other. Like that's what an investment bank does, right? Or high frequency trading firm. So the reason why Bittensor is like very powerful is you have a subnet that has purpose and has a good incentive mechanism, and a good scoring mechanism. You can essentially bring people from all around the world to contribute their expertise, their compute, to try and solve really, really hard problems. And what we're trying to do is currently a pretty hard problem, like modeling volatility for something like Bitcoin is very hard. And you need a massive variety of approaches and models. So right now in Bittensor, there's slots for 256 miners, Mog? 250?
Yep, 256 on subnets, with the exception of one of them.
So 250. You can have 256 miners all contributing different models. And your validators score those models. And the top model is that, what we use, or what people can call the API to get the data from to power their applications. So I think it's very much the kind of variety. Like if you need something that needs a variety of approaches and expertise, then Bittensor can also be a very good fit for that.
Okay. So I think I'm starting to wrap my head around this. So we've got, and to draw a comparison here, like for instance, say, OpenAI or something in one of these centralized models that is entirely built and in OpenAI's case, closed source. And so, they have their engineers contributing to this model, and then they put out, when they feel like they have a new version that is ready to release. Now, OpenAI does that, Claude does that, DeepSeek does that. DeepSeek is open source, but essentially same thing. They put out their own model. I haven't seen any production level tools that allow these models to coordinate with one another and to collaborate with one another. James, what I'm hearing you say is that, there's 256 miners or models. Is it the case that, once we have these models on a subnet or on the Bittensor network, they're able to coordinate, they're able to learn from one another, they're able to collaborate and share their level of intelligence with one another? Is that a more general idea of the way to think about these models and subnets on Bittensor?
Yes and no. What you are actually alluding to was one of the original ways that one of the first subnets was looked to be designed. This kind of mixture of experts model, where any miner could run any model and would be rewarded for diversity of responses. If you're talking about inference, you have to bear in mind that a subnet running inference is incentivizing speed, latency, accuracy of response. Now, Yuma consensus is very data agnostic. You can assign value and tiered value to any kind of data, not just a binary yes or no, but actually a weighted scoring. However, you still need to know what you consider to be the right response. If I was to ask DeepSeek, GPT, and Claude to write me a haiku on cats, who would be the objective judge as to whose was better, who should be rewarded correctly, which one? I mean, if you were making a haiku subnet, then your incentive would be on the formation of the haiku, etc., etc. So you would have other incentive mechanisms. But in terms of getting together to better each other, yes, this is possible. But in order to better each other, you have to be producing a data set to be including some potentially human feedback in the loop. And all of this is possible with multiple subnets. So you have a subnet such as Shoots, which can deploy any AI model, or it's basically serverless AI compute. It's currently serving DeepSeek. You also have subnet 19 is serving DeepSeek to OpenRouter, so you could use both of those. Also subnet 4, Targon. So there's 2 inference and 1 serverless AI compute that are all serving DeepSeek. So that gets your responses. Then you have fine-tuning subnets. There are many that are doing specific tasks based on what the subnet owners are trying to achieve. So DIPI are training character models on very specific data sets outputted from their commercial app. They're also doing a text-to-speech. Then you have some that are just trying to achieve state-of-the-art model benchmarks on specific data sets. And then you have subnets like gradients, which allow you to arrive with any base model in any data set and say, right, train those for 6 hours, 12 hours, and give me something back. So you can already start to understand what you're doing there. You then have subnets like Dojo. I'm not giving you numbers here, I'm only giving you names, but they provide human feedback. So you could then take any of those results and say, oh, we're going to get these over to Dojo to include this in our workflow. So what you start to see is the more you understand about, especially to do with the AI training, pre-training, fine-tuning, inference, human feedback, those are available, and there are some of the best quality subnets that we have at the moment in terms of their infrastructure, their build, the teams that are behind them are some of the ones with the most experience in the ecosystem. Then if you want to add in elements like financial predictions, let's take the outputs from Synth, let's mix them with another financial prediction subnet, or let's take those outputs from Synth and put them into one of the other prediction subnets as a data set, and then let's use that output to train another model. You see where we're going. The answer is yes, but it's going to take some imagination and understanding of all the different powers of the different subnets, essentially.
Yeah, and it's more understanding of the specialized nature of each of these, right? Because ultimately, at a high level, all of this looks like a decentralized intelligence network. That's how I understand BitTensor at a holistic level. But underneath the hood, when we start looking at individual subnets, these each perform a very specific specialized task. And those tasks kind of line up in the intelligence supply chain, if you will. That you went from pre-training to fine-tuning to inference to reinforcement, such as the intelligence supply chain. Each of these subnets produce and contribute a particular task in that supply chain to ultimately uh, create the most accurate and sophisticated intelligence that is outputted to the end user. So that really does help to add color and kind of fill in the gaps as to how these models work together. It's not just that we have one end-to-end model that is learning from another end-to-end model. These subnets actually contribute one piece of the model, and then they can collaborate with the others to each make the next piece better. So
You may not want all of the pieces of the puzzle. You may come in as an established provider of intelligence and say, well, we just want that, or we want to use these two bricks within our data flow.
yeah, yeah, and I think another parallel to draw here is the idea of a monolithic intelligence model, such would be an open AI or a Claude that is all developed end to end by the same production company, versus a more modular architecture such as BitTensor that has each of these subnets contributing modular components to the intelligence workflow.
I mean, the industry is evolving at such a fast pace. I think even OpenAI can't answer the question as to whether we'll have a monolithic model or specialized models. There are contrasting views within the industry on this. And what we thought 6 months ago may not be what we think today, and will certainly not be what we think in 6 months' time. And what BitTensor does have is the adaptability to move at a fast pace and provide the one thing that we were missing before, which was compute power, being able to access that compute. You spoke at the beginning of DeepSeek and what they've achieved. Of course, there's some ambiguity as to whether what training resources they actually had and they were allowed to have, and whether, without getting into the political side of this, whether this should be a barrier to being able to produce models. Surely the barrier to producing models should be imagination, quality of data sets, and pushing forward the frontiers of this ever fast growing industry.
Yeah. And so you mentioned that there was, just to pause on DeepSeek just for a moment. You mentioned that there was a couple of subnets here that are helping, or DeepSeek is using these subnets. Is is that the case? How, and you kind of mentioned that.
DeepSeek is on OpenRouter, and the I think Subnet 19 has surpassed Azure in providing inference for DeepSeek. I think they provided over 1 billion tokens in the last week or so, in the last couple of weeks. I'll have to pull out the stats, but I'm 100% sure they surpassed Azure as the number one provider of DeepSeek inference through OpenRouter.
Wow. So this does highlight the idea that a distributed system with its more modular parts has been able to supersede, some of these other inference contributors in the context of DeepSeek and the providers that they're taking into account.
Absolutely. You can consider mining on Subnet 19 as a full-time job, and it's not one person sitting there spinning up a 4090 or whatever they need and providing inference to that. People are running load balanced, highly technically very efficient setups, and it's incredibly competitive. And there will be times when there'll be dominance by a miner or group of miners who will start to eat up more spaces, and the others will have to catch up. But by having this competition through limited space and essentially a fight for resources, it creates this Darwinian effect of a constant evolution. And that's allowed 19 and other inference subnets to really provide, in terms of speed, latency, and reliability, the up as good as, if not better than, the centralized providers who are relying on their own choices in infrastructure, whereas you've got competing infrastructure providers saying, I can do this quicker, better, faster, more reliable.
I love it. I love it because early in this podcast, as we were talking through the incentive mechanisms, I was thinking to myself, okay, well, if there is a relative market share component and those who earn the most end up dictating the incentives for everyone else, it felt like a rich get richer type of thing. As you gain more market share, you dictate more incentives, you can allocate those to yourself, and the flywheel continues until one subnet dominates the entire ecosystem. But I think you point, and through this course of conversation, I think we hit on a very important point, which is the biodiversity or subnet diversity of the ecosystem. And it's not such that one subnet, if all subnets were the same, one could dominate and one could get richer if they had a better go-to-market strategy, et cetera, et cetera. But because of the diversity here, that one subnet that ends up getting really popular is actually potentially dependent on other subnets in the ecosystem, and wouldn't so much call it altruistically, but would it be in its best interest to reallocate incentives to other subnets other than itself in order to keep the diversity of this ecosystem alive and flourishing?
I mean, inference has always been the popular narrative for quite a long time, and the inference subnets have taken up the largest majority share of emissions for a while. But this has just been, I would say, because it was easier to bring those to market parallel performance with mainstream providers, whereas some of the other things that are being built on Bittensor have really taken a slightly more creative approach to doing something new. And it's a new breed of subnets, such as shoots, such as Celium Compute, that are really challenging existing models of businesses and doing something that can potentially only be done on Bittensor. And these are the ones that are set to rise up. I feel like DETAI will be this catalyst for this, because people have, I wouldn't say become stagnant in their appraisal of emissions in the last month or so, but with so much focus on this new mechanism, we're looking at it, we're studying it, we're preparing for it, we're living in this future moment that will be live next week, that a lot of us have just sort of said, well, let's leave the past way of deciding emissions behind. So I feel like there will be definitely a rising up of new champions of emission very, very, very soon with novel business models.
We've got one right here. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, I think the other thing that like some people discount with Bittensor is like how powerful the incentives are. And yeah, I don't know in dollar terms how much in the last 12 months has gone to powering subnets and miners and validators, but is it around like close to $1 billion? Maybe like 500 million, between 500 million and $1 billion. So there's been just under $1 billion going into essentially, this system, and it's been incredible. How like that? I mean, the output is obviously incredible because the incentives are so strong, and I think DTAO is going to accelerate that further, and potentially level the playing field for new people coming into the ecosystem, which I think is super exciting.
Yeah. And Mog, you mentioned that the incentive mechanism here follows Bitcoin in the sense that we have a diminishing inflation rate. I'm not as familiar with the tokenomics of Tao.
The tokenomics of Tao are a swan song, a testament to Bitcoin. So they directly mirror, with the first halving at 10.5 million emission, which at this point will be late this year. I think it's a slightly elongating date because, or delayed date, because Tau can be recycled through registration and then various other aspects. But we're talking, I think in 2022 it was in August, and now we're sometime in November. So it will be either mid to late November or early December this year will be the first halving.
Got it. Well, that's certainly a date to look out for. Cool. And most of our audience is it's crypto native for the most part, right? Builders, investors. So we have recently had quite a few AI conversations, but I think still people are kind of opening their mind to the idea of AI and, coming out of the trenches, if you will, and kind of expanding their knowledge base. And so you mentioned that inference kind of dominates and overpowers like a lot of this ecosystem. Could you just break down inference for the layperson and maybe speak to why inference is so important for AI development?
Well, inference being prompt response. I type in some text and the model gives me a response. I request an image, and I get an image, or in fact, within Bittensor, a 3D model. But it's essentially ask question, get response. It's the most understandable and usable, and it's a GPT effect. A GPT is what brought this to the public eye. It's the easiest thing to build applications on. It's the thing that we use most of all in our day-to-day lives, especially as developers, content creators. Any of us sitting in front of a computer, our lives have been made infinitely easier by being able to have a friend who'll write the long form version, so we only have to write the short form, or correct our code, or answer a question that we used to Google before. We don't Google it anymore, we look it up online. And so there's huge value in this. This is where the initial gold rush towards building things were, what has been in terms of applications. But this is not a short-sighted, but it's a view on the now. It's building on the now of AI. And of course, those within the industry know where this is going, with the drive towards AGI, ever more powerful models, ways of getting agents to perform tasks on our behalf. And as I said to you in the beginning in private, I'm not an AI/ML engineer. Everything I've learned about AI, I've learned through my involvement within Bittensor. My specialism has always been products, and the products that can come out of this. And I can still imagine products that we will see in the next couple of years that I always dreamed about as a child. And these will be powered by ever increasing powerful models and compute. And so it's obvious why inference was the easy one out there. But the more you understand the necessity behind these other tools. It's like comparing email as the antithesis of the internet. So much more is done with the internet, but our parents understand email as what it was that brought the internet to their prevalence. It was post replaced by email. The internet does a lot more powerful things. Now we don't say it's only for going shopping, do we? It again does a lot more powerful things, but we understand the need for the sort of public.
Absolutely. Cool, guys. I mean, this has been an incredible podcast. I really appreciate it. And I certainly learned a lot, not just about Bittensor and the ecosystem there, but also the way in which these components interact with one another to create an intelligence supply chain and the incentives at play in that supply chain. So, guys, congrats on the partnership with Synth, the 50th subnet deploying onto Bittensor, and the entire Bittensor community transitioning from maybe it's early stage bootstrapping mode into a more mature market, mature market and diverse ecosystem.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Epic.